208 billion transistors.
Let me tell you a story about a war. Not the kind fought with tanks and soldiers, but one fought in boardrooms, tech labs, and behind closed doors in Washington and Beijing. At the heart of this battle is something smaller than a fingernail, the microchip. This is the biggest thing happening in geopolitics right now. A battle between the United States and China over these chips which enable the AI revolution. It's a conflict that's going to define the global order for years to come. Imagine a world without smartphones, cars, internet, or even without camera. Tough, right? These little pieces of silicon are everywhere, quietly powering the devices we use to work, entertain, and connect. So microchips make our economy, our technology possible, but not only consumer tech, it's also military. Military needs microchips, chips for weapon systems, for intelligence, for AI. They need microchips to stay ahead of rivals. Microchips represent geopolitical power because they represent artificial intelligence power, technology power, and military power. And one company stands at the heart of it all, Nvidia. Now the world's most valuable company, worth over $4 trillion. Its CEO Jensen Huang is doing the unthinkable, yet fascinating work of trying to bridge the gap between the United States and China. Let's break this down. To understand today's chip war, we have to go back to 1958. Back then, computers were giant clunky machines full of wires, but two American engineers had a bold idea to replace those wires with something better, silicon. They invented the microchip using tiny switches called transistors. Suddenly machines could think faster, remember more, and shrink in size. This breakthrough changed the world. Over the decades, chips became more powerful. They made TVs smarter, video games possible, and sent NASA to the moon. Then came tech giants like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, who used chips to bring computers and smartphones into our daily lives. And with every year, more and more transistors were packed onto a single chip, making them faster, smaller, and essential. But making these chips isn't easy. You need special factories called fabs, where even a speck of dust can ruin everything. They cost billions to build. At first, the United States led in both design and manufacturing. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Asia, countries like Japan entered the chip race. Japanese companies, backed by government subsidies, started making chips cheaper than the US could. And they started to dominate the semiconductor market during the 80s. The US wasn't happy with this. In 1987, they hit back, imposing a 100% tax on Japanese chips, which crushed Japan's chip industry. Ironically, this happened under the President Reagan, a free market advocate. The message was clear: chips are too important to leave to free markets. But this wasn't the end of the story. Nearby Japan, another country was rising fast: China. As China grew, so did talk of unifying with Taiwan. Taiwan, seeing the threat, they knew they need US support for protection. So they needed to do something to preserve their independence, and they made a brilliant move. At the time, many Taiwanese engineers were studying and working in the United States at top tech companies like Intel. Taiwan's government decided to bring them back by covering travel costs, offering funding, and supporting startups to build a Silicon Valley in Taiwan. And it worked. Thousands returned, sparking Taiwan's microchip industry. One of them, Maurice Chang, had a game-changing idea. Instead of competing directly with the US chip makers like Japan did, he proposed partnering with them. His company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, wouldn't design chips or devices, but would focus solely on manufacturing them in advanced factory or fabs. This solved a major problem for US companies, as fabs were incredibly expensive to maintain. That saved US companies money and made them dependent on Taiwan for manufacturing. The Taiwanese government backed TSMC with money, support, and vision. It worked. Taiwan became the center of global chip production, creating what's now called the Silicon Shield, a high-tech buffer against Chinese aggression. By 2010, chips were so advanced they had over 1 billion transistors, each smaller than a virus. Today, 92% of the world's most advanced chips are made in Taiwan. And that's how one tiny island became the most important place in the tech world and a key player in the global chip market. While Taiwan thrived, China watched and learned. By the 2000s, China was growing rapidly, becoming a massive consumer of microchips. It imported 40% of the world's chips to power its factories, economy, and military. But there was a problem. China didn't make advanced chips. It relied on the US and Taiwan. This global chain works like this. The US designs chips and makes the software and machines. Japan provides metals and chemicals. The Netherlands makes the lasers to core the chips. Taiwan produces the chips and China buys them to fuel its economy and military. And that's where the tensions began. So the China is using US technology to get ahead of the US technology. US chip companies were selling chips to China to advance its military. And what really woke up US is when China in 2019 introduced ballistic hypersonic missiles going 5 times speed of sound. It's undetectable and has capacity to carry nuke. And it was American microchip technology that helped them build it. So China is ahead in missiles and they might get ahead in AI as well with the US tech. And US got to do something here. Sanctions. No more chips to China, no more free trade, no more free market. Cut China out even more. Biden and now Trump administration went that far that any global company that works with US chips should ban their sale to China. The goal here is to slow down China's military tech, keep AI and supercomputing power in US hands. The US has imposed several rounds of sanctions on China. These sanctions aimed to curb Chinese ability to produce high-tech semiconductor industry. Over 140 Chinese companies, including major players like Huawei, have been added to the list. But instead of crippling China, those restrictions seem to have backfired. While these sanctions have slowed down Chinese progress, they have also spurred a push toward self-reliance. Chinese companies are innovating and investing heavily in domestic alternatives, with Huawei, for example, developing new AI chips to replace those from the US. This impacts US companies like Nvidia, AMD, Oracle, which lose billions in revenue. To counter this, the US invests over $50 billion to build chip factories domestically, even convincing Taiwan TSMC to build a factory in Arizona. China, meanwhile, faces chip restrictions and may turn to Taiwan as a key player in this economic conflict. This fight over chips has become a high-stake economic war between the US and China, challenging the very idea that globalization and interdependence bring peace. As Cold War vibes return, the world watches to see what happens next. This brings us to one of the biggest players today, Nvidia. Jensen Huang was born in Taiwan in 1963 and moved to the US at the age of 9, speaking little English. He studied electric engineering, earned a master's from Stanford and worked at major tech firms before co-founding Nvidia in 1993. Under his leadership, Nvidia grew into a global tech giant powering AI and supercomputing, making Huang one of the most influential figures in tech today. Jensen Huang's recent back-to-back diplomatic tours through Washington and Beijing underscore the new centrality of corporate actors in global geopolitics. Nvidia, now the world's most valuable publicly traded company, has become a microcosmos of the US-China tech competition, balancing on the knife's edge between strategic dominance and commercial interdependence. The US greenlighting Nvidia's resumed chip sales to China while still restricting cutting-edge semiconductor exports reflects a nuanced shift in Trump's economic nationalism, recognizing that maintaining leverage over Chinese AI sector requires continued market presence. At the same time, Chinese embrace of open source AI and its ability to innovate under constraints signals that decoupling remains incomplete and reversible. Nvidia's tightrope diplomacy could become a template for other tech giants navigating Cold War 2.0, where CEOs must play statesmen and strategists alike. This isn't just a trade dispute, it's a Cold War 2.0, but with CEOs instead of soldiers. Chips are the new oil, the foundation of everything from AI to nuclear weapons, and Taiwan is the new Middle East. Nobody knows how this will end, but one thing is clear: this fight over these tiny pieces of silicon will shape the 21st century. So what happens next? Will the US win the chip race by reshoring its factories? Can China become self-reliant and build its own chip empire? And can Taiwan stay safe as the world depends on its silicon shield? Thanks for watching and see you in the next episode.